Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we're continuing on with the good siding area, and this is where we left off with a little bit of a mishap with the ballasting side of things, but of course I think I managed to do a reasonably good rescue job on that area. So where we left off in the previous video, I'd managed to sort out the groundwork around the Goodsyard sidings, and of course using the tile grout method. And as you know from the previous video, I had a few problems, but I think I managed to salvage the situation. So today we're looking at adding some further detail to this area, and of course that includes weathering, and then of course once that's complete we'll be also looking at adding weeds, tufts of grass, discarded sleepers, rails, and maybe some more obvious points of ballast areas as well. So as part of the weathering process for the ground area around the sidings, I also want to weather up the goods shed a bit more. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, I did weather this rather lightly some years back, but I certainly want to add some heavier tone to it. Now, what I need to do is weather the groundwork first so that I can get inside the goods shed where the track runs through, and then once that's complete, then I can put the goods shed into place, and this will actually be permanently anchored in. So I use the usual methods, which is of course the ground up chalk pastels, and then dust it on, and I really sort of went to town a bit more with this in order to keep it in line with the retaining wall that just recently got built, so that there's a little bit of a relationship going on between the goods shed and this retaining wall, as if they were maybe built during a similar period. So as you can see, I have begun doing a little bit of weathering to the track, and I quite like using what I call the cheats method of weathering. So rather than using an airbrush and pre-painting the sleepers, pre-painting the edges of the rails, I just do a dry brush method once the track is laid and ballasted, and you kind of end up killing two birds with one stone, because you get the grime that you would naturally expect around the rails from rail dust and things like that, but you also end up getting the griminess on the edge of the rails as well, where you often get a build-up of grime, rail dust, and even a bit of rust and things like that. And I just find the dry brush method just a really easy way of doing it. So what I'm actually using is just some good old-fashioned house paint that you can get in test pots, and I'm just using a very dull muted earth tone to start the process, and I may add in some other tones in certain areas, particularly around things like points where there'll be a lot more build-up of grime, and possibly more sort of black grimy areas as well. And you don't have to be precious about whether it's going on the rails, of course, because that all gets cleaned up afterwards. So yeah, it's quite a simple process, and in a way I kind of feel like there's a little bit more control over how the tones are blended in to the surrounding area. So although you can achieve that, of course, with an airbrush, I do sort of find using a dry brush technique gets quite a nice effect, and in some ways it's a little bit more random. I often find where folk have used an airbrush to weather ballast and track and things like that, that it almost looks a bit too perfect. It kind of, I call it Photoshop modeling, and it's where the uniformity is just a bit too much. Whereas of course with a dry brush it's a little bit more analog, and it sort of tends to follow its course in a more sort of a natural way. So yeah, anyway, we'll carry on with this, and of course I'll speed up this process. So what I'm doing here now is just adding in just some areas of more prominent ballast. So referring back to the image that I'm using for a reference, there are some certain areas where it seems like the ballast is exposed and not compacted down as much. So this is what I'm doing here. Now what I'm actually using is a Pico product, and what I'm doing is just spreading this around, and then of course I'll use the usual method of the watered down PVA glue, and hopefully it'll work. Hopefully it's not going to damage the surface underneath. So of course once this is all set, then of course I'll be going over it and weathering these areas further, and particularly around the point areas of course there's going to be a lot of grease and grime because there's tended to be quite a build-up of much darker, almost sort of black grease, oil stains and so forth in here, and I'm only assuming that was really to do with the point mechanisms that needed, you know, regular maintenance. So there'll also be some darker areas in here that I'll add in, which will be where locomotives would be paused, and of course they're going to drop their oil and grease and steam locomotive cinders and ash and things like that that might be built up there. I did actually go around this area with slightly different tone of the house paint. It's got a slightly more greenish tone in there, of course, to represent the fact that this was a cattle dock, maybe a disused one now, but nonetheless there would have been quite a bit of effluent, I guess, that might have been building up around this area, hence a slightly more greenish, icky tone to it. So as I said, we'll let this dry and come back to it. So as you can see, I've moved on a little bit further, and of course I've added in these slightly more obvious clumps of ballast, and of course that was the Pico fine grade grey weathered ballast, and then of course I've then gone over the top of that and weathered that as well. And as you can see, I popped in some discarded sleepers, so they're just simply cut from a strip of balsa wood, which was pretty close to the actual dimensions of the sleepers, and of course they're all weathered up. I just used a dark wash to stain those up, and then of course we've got some discarded rail here as well. And what I'm actually doing now is adding in these areas of oil and grease, so they appear quite random within the example image that I've been referencing, but they certainly are more prominent, these patches around point work, which, as I think I mentioned previously, was obviously to do with maintenance. So what I'm actually using here, and I've actually found this a very good way of doing these sort of oily, greasy patches, is I'm just using a specific type of colour pencil. So if we can get this into the shot and we can read that, it's Derwent ink tints pencils, and these are absolutely fantastic. So what you do is just rub on or draw on the areas where you want this dark patches to go, and then simply run a wet paintbrush over it, and it literally sort of turns it into almost like an ink type compound. So it's not watercolor pencils, and Derwent are quite specific about that they're not watercolor pencils, that they are actually almost like an ink, and they are seriously good. And the interesting thing is I actually discovered this through one of our members at the local model railway club that I attend and am a member of, and one of the chaps there used these pencils for weathering rolling stock wagons, and they looked absolutely fantastic. They looked absolutely brilliant. So of course immediately straight away I was off down to the artist's shop here in Christchurch, and that's Gordon Harris sell these if you're based here in New Zealand, and they're absolutely fantastic for doing this kind of work. And so they've become my new favourite product. So you really do get this griminess, and depending on how little or how much water you apply, it increases the intensity. So the more water, of course, the more washed out. And of course the same applies to if you only just put on a smidgen of this pencil, it is plenty to go around. So the stuff, yep, I absolutely love it. It's fantastic. So they come in various different shades. Of course, you wouldn't think that any of these were any different, but they are. There's some very subtle differences in the colours of these pencils. But the one I'm actually using is called Indian Ink 2020. So yeah, that's what I'm doing here, and just working my way around point work. I'll probably put a little bit in here, of course, which is a head shunt where you might possibly get locomotives paused for a wee while. So I've now got the grease and oil stains all complete, and now it's a case of just adding a few tufts of weeds and so forth in various places around the yard. So I'm just using a blend, so it's I think a blend between possibly 2 or 4 millimeter green and a bit of 4 millimeter straw. So we sort of end up with a bit of both. So we're just going to load up our reservoir and just do a few small areas. Of course there might be a little bit more around the edges, and I might treat that separately around fence lines and so forth. It's just sort of looking at particular areas in between the tracks, and you know, around these areas here. And I'm just using neat Mod Podge for this, the matte Mod Podge, which does seem to work pretty well. So that's where we have it at this stage, and of course, as you can see, it's bringing on a life of its own, which is what I was hoping to achieve. So there's still yet to be more static grass. There's probably going to be more little mounds of coarser gravel or ballast in certain areas, and particularly around where I've just temporarily added in some Pico buffer stops, which of course I've painted up and weathered as well. So I think it's certainly looking the part now, and it's really capturing the essence of a well used and well worn good siding area. Now, some of the other components that I would like to add is obviously some form of ground signals that possibly would have been at the entry point into the two sidings. Now, I'm not actually too sure what type of ground signals I should be using. Are they those disc shaped ground signals that sort of had, I think, a red line through the middle of it on a white background? Or are we getting into the stage where colour light ground signals were used? So the period of the layout is quite broad in some sense. It's late 50s through to even pushing through into the very early 70s. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, or what kind of ground signals I should be using, and even actually where they should be going. Now, one of the other components to add, of course, is a loading gauge as well. Now, I did have one in the previous setup, and I'm not quite sure whether I'll reinstate the one that I had there, or whether I might actually go for one with a little bit more detail. And I think Wills and Ratio, they do some loading gauge kits that might work better in this area. And I imagine the loading gauge would be just at the end of the goods platform, where the entry point is into the actual goods shed area. So there we have it. I'll leave it there for this particular video. As I said, there's still plenty more to add into the area, and hopefully come the next video in this particular series, there will be some further detail that I can show and explain how I did it and so forth. So once again, thank you for tuning in. I certainly hope you gathered some inspiration and ideas for your own layouts. So do take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.